Chris, thank you very, very much for joining me today. Um, I wanted to kick off with asking you about your fabulous book, Market Crafters.
Yes.
Um, you give us the whole title because I read it on my Kindle, so I don't have. I've
Oh my
posted the
God, I
cover
gotta
of
get my
it.
prop. It's in the other
You
room.
got to
Should I
get your
go?
you got to get your prompt, but it is called Market
It is.
Crafters,
It's called, the title is Market Crafters, the 100-Year Struggle to Shape the American Economy.
right? So just tell us, what is a market crafter, and what's the premise of the book, and why do you write it?
So we have this longstanding myth that folks on the left and right share, that markets are usually free and self-regulating. And the point of government, at least when it comes to economics, is to be sort of like the emergency room. When things don't go
Yeah.
well, here comes the market, you fix it up, you bail out a bank, you give somebody unemployment insurance, and off you go back into the market. And I've been working on economic issues for about a decade now as an activist in some cases, but really as a researcher and academic. And what you see in the history is that that just isn't true. What's actually more true is that there are policymakers in government who are shaping markets, crafting markets, channeling all those private sector entrepreneurial energies towards public goals, often making Americans richer, making us safer, making our financial lives more stable. And a lot of the time they're successful. Sometimes they fail. And I wrote the book to, first off, just surface these stories so people know what's actually happening, but also to pull out some of the lessons for contemporary public policy debates, where we go from here on the other side of the insanity of Trumponomics.
Well, so I want to sort of ask you about the end of your book, which you closed right last year, before Trump 2.0 begins.
Yeah.
But what I think is so interesting about what you write um, is how actually the sort of rising stars on the right, as in Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley, JD Vance, those last two from Yale Law School graduates, actually agree about the importance of market crafting.
Yeah.
Um, with Lena Khan, Jake Sullivan, uh, Brian Deese, on the left, that
Yeah.
actually um, they seem to be in agreement. I mean, is that a fair?
Well, so there are a couple things in there. So first off, market craft is a way of harnessing markets for public goals. So it's not good or bad in and of itself. It's sort of like tax policy or industrial policy or competition policy. These are all ways that we can organize or manage an economy, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons, and even how we define good and bad is rolled up in our politics, what we think is important. So when we start talking about like, where do Marco Rubio and Lena Khan, or where do the Republicans and the Democrats agree, I think it's really important to be clear that they diverge on what they're building for a lot of the time, but I do see significant overlap in the how question. On both sides of the aisle, there is a newfound realization that markets need management to work for people, that we don't work for markets, markets work for us. I mean, that's literally a line in Marco Rubio's most recent book. It is something that Josh Hawley says both on the campaign trail, in op-eds in the New York Times,
Mm.
and in the Senate. And it's something that J.D. Vance believes, axiomatically, as his support for Lena Khan shows. That's a really different Republican Party than the one from George W. Bush years, where the conventional wisdom was like, guys, just let markets do their thing. That's the key to prosperity. Now the modern Republican Party is saying that's not going to go well on its own. And I think it's because what has caused that shift? What's the difference? I
Yeah.
think on the right, the big things have been the rise of China and the pandemic. And on the left, it's those two things, of course, too, but also the great financial crisis and climate change. So the combination of these events have pretty much changed the way that we talk about economics, and I think have birthed a new framework for us to use, even though what JD Vance and Marco Rubio want most of the time is to lower taxes for the rich, to have more billionaires, as we can see this administration is pursuing, or across the board tariffs where we, tax everything and raise costs for American families. This is not my politics.
Right.
And they are putting the state at the center of their story of how the economy should work, and that is very different.
Is there anything that Trump this time around is doing that fits into that mold? I mean, there is a sense that the free trade is considered a bad thing, right? I think on
Yeah.
both sides. So in that
Yeah.
sense, the tariffs, are probably in line, but maybe not the way he did it.
Well, so for me, when you craft a market, you have to have a goal. And then
Right.
you have to marshal public policy in service of that goal. So ironically, in Trump 1, there was a clear goal. Let's make semiconductors here in America, not in Taiwan,
Yeah.
because we don't think that that's safe. And we can see that we need to onshore advanced semiconductor manufacturing if we want to have the leading military that we want to have. Okay, so that was a Trump idea that then in the Biden administration gained extra steam and got over the finish line in the form of the Chips and Science Act. So Congress had a clear mission. Let's make chips here at home.
Yeah.
It appropriated $50 billion to the Secretary of Commerce and gave the department pretty wide discretion to use that as they saw fit. They made a ton of investments. And now we have 5 of the world's leading advanced semiconductor manufacturers here in the United States, either making the chips or about to make the chips. I mean, TSMC is making the chips for the cutting edge, the next iPhone here in Arizona. So that's a market craft, all right? What is not a market craft to me is taxing all goods in the form of
Right.
tariffs. What's the goal of that? They might say, oh, to bring back manufacturing jobs. It's like, okay, then why are we tariffing avocados or Barbie dolls? Or you see what I'm saying? Like when it's
Yes, I
across the
do.
board and it's not targeted, that's not crafting a market. That's, I mean, and the impulsivity makes it, somebody said at one point, it's more like market crashing than market crafting. So I do not see market craft in in this administration, but that's not to say that like it's a partisan thing. Like half of the
Right.
characters in the book that I write about are Republicans, many of whom are very successful at crafting markets. It's just not what's going on in this one.
I got the sense in the last chapters, which obviously are about our generation. I'm older than you. I mean but well, I think Marco Rubio and I are probably contemporaries, but that you had spent quite a lot of time with some of those players. Particularly, I got the impression you knew Brian
Yeah,
pretty well.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so was and the floating cameo appearances of Larry Summers. I mean, talk to me about that, because it's sort of like he starts off in the book. He's there obviously in the chapters about the financial crisis and Lehman. In fact, he's there before. I think, in fact, don't you bring him in when he's a 7-year-old child?
Yes, actually, the first time he appears, you are a very astute reader, Vicky. He appears in an early chapter that's about the first Black Fed governor who teaches at Wharton, where I'm doing my PhD, and a young Larry Summers comes up to Brimmer afterward, and Brimmer remembers it, and it's in his papers, and he is, obviously that small Larry Summers becomes eventually the Treasury Secretary and the director of the National Economic Council and all of these things. But yes, that's his
Yeah.
first appearance.
But and so what, I mean, you write very well, in a way, Chris, that I can't necessarily always, I can't tell what you think. But I mean, there are some fascinating scenes. I love the scene when Larry in 2010 calls Elizabeth Warren into, I think it's the Bombay Club or something,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of says you can choose your lane, whether to be an insider or an outsider. And Elizabeth Warren chooses, as we know, the outsider lane. But then 10 years later, as you
They
say,
switched. Right.
he even makes a speech about it, right? Saying, I'm not, I'm my days of government behind me. Now
Yeah.
I'm going to be in the outside lane. So what has been, and he's been sometimes critical of what Lena and co have done,
Yeah.
and yet not. I mean, what's your sort of big takeaway?
I think he's mostly critical. But he was supportive of the IRA and some of the
Yeah,
policies at the end of the day. So I think that may be what you're getting at. So the way, for those people who haven't taken a look at the book, the last third of the book is about how do we go from that, what many call the Washington consensus, free markets are great, to the moment that we live in now. And in order to tell that story, I really trace the genealogy of two characters, primarily Brian Deese, who is a lesser known figure, who was the director of the National Economic Council for Joe Biden. And then I also tell the story of Lena Khan. Okay, so Larry Summers is particularly relevant to Brian's story because Brian starts out as effectively a Summers protege.
yeah,
He is on the Obama campaign in 2008 and then joins the National Economic Council to work for Larry in 2009. And Brian's tasked with overseeing the auto bailout. And it's amazing that the lessons that Brian takes from that are very different from the ones that Larry takes from that. For Larry and that crew, that's the emergency room view. The markets had failed. Government needed to be there to prevent further damage, but then once they're recapitalized, off they go. And that's
right.
successful. Brian learned something else from that, which is that actually we can't be bailing out these companies again and again. We have to be crafting these markets to be resilient, to work in a way that means that they're going to be strong and not constantly collapsing, which means pushing them to keep up with the times and with international competitiveness. So I track Brian's story, and I won't take everybody through every step of the way, but the short version is he goes from being the proverbial kid in the room. I mean, he's
Yeah,
20s, but the young man in the room to then being the boss. Okay, so in the Biden administration, he becomes the director of the National Economic Council, and he's really the most influential voice of the entire administration on economic policy. Janet Yellen, as a Treasury Secretary, has a different focus. It's really Brian behind the scenes who is working to architect the entire program. And so what you see is you see an approach that says the government has an opportunity and a responsibility to shape markets to get more clean energy investment, to get more of those semiconductors made at home, to build infrastructure, and then also to ensure that markets are competitive and fair. And so he becomes, at least in my sense, like the leading light of that outlook. And of course, there's Larry on the
yeah,
outside, um, throwing rocks in a sense. I mean, very aggressively criticizing Brian and the administration's economic policy, both publicly on Twitter, on Bloomberg, and also privately. And um, though I think they continue to be friends, they see it as respectful roles where they're each saying what they have to say. But that clash, I think, is emblematic of the bigger clash of these sets of ideas, where on the one hand, it's just markets are going to fail. You've got to be ready to help out when they do. And on the other, it's like we don't have to use that logic. We can craft them to make them work better. And that contrast, I think, is the key storyline.
yeah. I will say I knew very little about Brian Deese, so I think that the human story that you told about him, I found very, very interesting. There's a very
Yeah,
sweet anecdote that
people
you
know a
do
lot more
say
about Luna than they know about Brian,
they
which
a lot more.
yeah,
And there is a rather charming story what with Obama about Fiat or Chrysler,
yeah,
that what with that he's nervous and he pipes up and he means to say something about 40 miles to the gallon or something.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
do you want to just say it? And instead he says, if we get this right, American cars will be able to go 40 miles an hour or something.
Yeah.
something.
It's just like a total slip up,
Yeah,
which
yeah,
he doesn't even realize. It's a slip of the tongue. He doesn't realize it at the time, but it's pretty important meeting, and he's like on point to talk about these things, and everybody laughs, and Obama writes about it in his memoir, because I think people write it because everyone liked Brian and respected Brian, and saw him as, a bright light, an up and comer who would have a major impact on the world. And then, you fast forward 15 years, and there he is doing exactly that.
Well, so let's go back to, what in the short term I would say definitely caused this switch, which is the financial crisis, which for me was like going down memory lane when you opened with Hank Paulson and the infamous story about him deciding not to take sleeping pills on the most important weekend in terms of the economy in September 2008, deciding the fate of Lehman Brothers. I was really fascinated to read this, not least because actually I'm in talks with the BBC about possibly going back and revisiting my book, The Devil's Casino, about what happened to Lehman,
Yeah.
and going back and talking to ideally Hank and Dick Fold about their view of it. Now we're so, I guess, hang on, we're 2018. We will be
Yeah.
20 years.
I bet they
So
would tell you the same thing, though. I think you got to talk to the Fed staffers who were told no, and like Tim Guy. Anyway, I don't mean to cut you off,
yes,
but I
no,
think
I got that, and so I got the sense that
right.
you sort of believed there was daylight between Alan Greenspan's view of what the government should be doing. And obviously, Alan Greenspan was no longer a Fed chair by then, right? But we were riding high, if you can call it that, on his philosophies, right? About how it's in the market self-interest, right? To regulate itself, not what can go wrong. And he loved derivatives. He was very much behind all these financial instruments.
Right.
Okay, and then and that idea, I think, went for like 40. I mean, this went on for decades.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what could go wrong except that we have the subprime mortgage crisis and credit default swaps. And I'm just going to give a plug to my college roommate, is in your book, Blythe Masters, very
Yeah.
important role she played at JP Morgan, and Gillian Tett, who wrote about Blythe. And Blythe then introduced Gillian to me, and I introduced Gillian to her husband. So
That's
what can I
amazing.
tell you?
Well,
It's a
you're in the
small
center of all this. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's almost a smaller world as Yale Law School.
Yeah.
But so but go back, because I very much get the impression from you that despite Alan Greenspan's bullishness about free market, he would have, if he had been in charge, the outcome would have been different
Yeah.
regarding Lehman.
So I think there's so many important figures here, and I think this really was um, sometimes there are these hinge moments of history, call them critical junctures, call them what you will, that really do matter. And that weekend when Lehman imploded was one of those. So it's why I spend a whole chapter on it, because not only because of the events themselves, but what they say about the shift in political economy. So leading into that weekend, or that period in general, let's say, Alan Greenspan is the Fed chair. He's
Yeah.
there for 20 years and is widely beloved, just really, really respected. He oversees a period of low to moderate interest rates and consistent growth, and he's called the Maestro, is the nickname. And by the way, when he says goodbye, just months before the financial crisis, one person at the big goodbye party, which is a conference, of course, raises their hand to ask some direct and probing questions, and Larry Summers says, "How dare you?" Because there is a sense that Alan has gotten virtually
Right.
everything right. Okay, so what was Greenspan actually about? We know mostly about the deregulatory story of Greenspan. He wanted financial markets to work better. I think that's an important story, and even though it's not, I mean, I'm skeptical of it, but he did have a cogent theory behind it. And I think that when we understand that, we can understand the second key ingredient. Greenspan believed that financial markets, when they became more efficient, they actually got safer because it enabled individuals or investors in the market to have more information about what was going on. And so they could identify risk points that could be worked into prices. People could see that someone was seeing risk or in a company's position, and so then they could probe it, whether that's from the outside or whether that's from the inside. So there was this axiomatic belief that efficiency was important, and the best way to get efficiency in that time was to innovate. So
Right.
Greenspan has a market craft where he says his goal is not just get government out of the way, it's to use the central bank and other pieces of the government to encourage financial innovation, which is not just the faster kind of trading that maybe we all know about from Michael Lewis novels, but also some of the other things that we have heard about but might be rusty, like credit default swaps or the
Yeah.
special purpose vehicles. Each one of these things actively needed government to say, yes, that is a good idea. You should develop a product that is insurance like, and that should be sold. Yes, you should do this complex securitization of these securities, including mortgage-backed ones. And it's yes, special purpose vehicles, which enable you to keep it off the balance sheet. That's a good idea to do too. And so I track each one of these public policy changes because Greenspan is championing them as the advocate of financial innovation. Now, everybody knows how that story ends with the great crash of 2008. Of course, Greenspan has just previously retired, so it's left to his successor, Ben Bernanke, and Hank Paulson to oversee the response. But then comes the real irony. In Greenspan's tenure, when things had gone south, he had worked with the other institutional partners to support financial institutions to have orderly wind downs. People even named it. It's called the Greenspan put. You generally believed that the Fed would be there to prevent collapse in financial markets. Okay. Then Hank Paulson's in the chair, and Hank's approach is more purely libertarian. Somebody has to fail. We've bailed out Bear Stearns in the spring. We just did Fannie and Freddie. Now Lehman is threatening. What's going to happen next? There was already bad blood between Folda and, as you write about, between Folda and
Yes.
Paulson and others. And so there was a human component to it. And so eventually on that Sunday, when the Barclays deal falls through, they say, there's no plan B. There was a plan B. There were actually several different plan Bs that the Fed internally had developed, and that even for Lehman, but that were made available to Goldman and Morgan Stanley. So my point of saying all of this is that not to say like, oh, we should bail out all the banks. That's not what I think. I do believe that there are ways to have structured wind downs that are in an orderly fashion, like happened with the largest hedge fund in the world a decade before that, long-term capital management
Yeah.
in the Greenspan era, that would have prevented the scale of the crisis from happening. And of course, on Sunday, they refused to bail out Lehman. By Tuesday, there's so much chaos in the market. They bail out AIG to the tune of eventually $100 billion plus. And then it just keeps going
Yes.
for all the other major banks. And we know the story from there. But that was a pivotal moment because of the inputs that Greenspan had led the way for, and then B, this kind of like, well, just somebody has to pay approach that wasn't pragmatic and wasn't in line with the Greenspan's own approach to market panics and crises.
Mm. And I also thought, you reminded me in the telling of that, the role of the Brits and the British regulators in the whole
Yeah, and the
thing. Well,
FSA.
because, when I was reporting my book, I mean, the Lehman guys were very, very sore, obviously, about Hank Paulson. But second in line on their shit list would have been the British regulators who said they couldn't do the deal with Barclays for another 30 days.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
And then, ironically, the British branch of Lehman's was very furious with the Americans because they found that they woke up and discovered they were on their own on Monday morning.
Yes.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
it was a complicated, very complicated story. So, let me ask you this though. So, if we come back to the end of the book and how we've gone from the quote unquote free markets of that moment to this idea of government shaping the market overtly. How, I grew up in England, you grew up in America. How is this a form of capitalism that isn't socialism? Where does it differ?
Um, Socialism is when government owns the means of production. What
So,
I'm
and
talking
that's
about is crafting private markets. So we can stick with the financial stability example since that's where we just were. Government doesn't own the banks. I don't think that they should own the banks. Uh, Private credit is allocated by private sector profit-seeking actors. I think that's a good thing. And I think we want that to be stable. And we want to ensure that inflation is at best modest and that contributes to full employment. Because we believe that those are politically and economically valuable. So we don't sort of just let those markets run free. We say, well, wait a second. We don't want inflation. So the central bank, government institution, literally sets the price. It's not a price control, it's just price setting of short term credit
right.
in order to ensure that the economy doesn't get overheated or that we don't enter a deflationary spiral. Okay, so that's not to say that nobody owns that market. The state
Yeah.
doesn't even, I wouldn't use the framework of controlling that market, but it certainly crafts it and shapes it by using that price setting tool. And then, of course, on the financial stability front, everything from liquidity requirements to capital ratios to leverage ratios to the supervisory functions of the Federal Reserve and other institutions in the American government. All of these are built in to say, wait a second, these big institutions, when they fail, it creates chaos in markets, and oftentimes governments on the hook to to support them. We need to get
Right.
out in front of that, craft those markets so that they are more stable, so that there's not so much risk that they could implode. So we are actively shaping those markets through government policy in a way that I think more often than not is a good thing. But that's not socialism,
No.
right? Credit is
No.
still
But I think
privately allocated by
I
private
think
actors who own the banks and by we all know make plenty of money doing it.
yeah. Yeah. Well, I think it's just important. I think it's great to walk us through that.
Yeah.
So the antitrust stuff, obviously, you do write a lot about Lena Khan's extraordinary
Yeah.
story. From Yale Law School to running the FTC. And your background, you wrote, you were one of the founders of Facebook. And then in 2019, you wrote this essay in the New York Times about arguing that it should be broken up. Um, you know, walk me through your sort of view of where big tech, where we are now, and what you hope is in the future.
There are a lot of crosswinds in this moment, particularly when it comes to tech, less so with antitrust more broadly. So let me speak about antitrust broadly and then be specific about tech. Um, you know, Lena Khan came in 2021. If probably most people who read your stuff and who are watching this know the basics of her story. Relatively young woman who'd been at Yale Law School, wrote the important piece on Amazon, and rose quickly through the field. Biden nominates her to be one of the commissioners of the FTC, and she, if people might not remember, she gets 12 Republicans to vote for her confirmation,
Including
and
Josh Hawley.
including Hawley and some other folks. And she becomes chair, and then becomes a very controversial and very successful figure. Successful if you believe, I believe that markets should be competitive, open, and fair, and that we need a robust antitrust and anti-monopoly policy to do that. And that's how capitalism works best. And I go through this extensively in the book. But by virtually all accounts, she was uh, incredibly successful at the role that she had. She starts off and blocks the NVIDIA acquisition of ARM, which was right before ChatGPT came out. So no one was really paying attention, but that would have consolidated that chip market even more than it is
Yeah.
now. That was a unanimous vote. And then over the following year, she has these big blockbuster cases that she wins, some in healthcare, like the Illumina Grail merger, some in groceries, like Kroger's and Albertsons wanted to merge, which would have been the biggest grocery store merger in history, which is successfully blocked. So she wins on these cases, and she rewrites the merger guidelines, which are the rules for who can merge and how. So it's not just about pennies on the dollar of extra price, but also about what happens to workers, what
Yeah.
happens to innovation. She then puts forth non-compete agreements, which make it
Yes.
so that labor markets are more competitive, and ends up winning 90% of the cases that the FTC brings under her leadership. So now she is clearly not liked by a lot of people,
Well, she
particularly
has a,
private
she has a,
equity,
right, exactly.
particularly private equity and the investor set. A lot of the startup folks I talked to, actually, I was just in San Francisco last week, um, are much more broadly supportive of her tenure. So it was really revolutionary. Now, you would think that this Trump crew that came in a few months ago would just tear it all up. It's not what they're doing. They are continuing to prosecute the Meta case. The Meta case, by the way, was brought under the first Trump administration. Lena Lena's FTC refiled it, but right now the Meta case is in trial in Washington. They are continuing the Amazon case. They even filed suit against Uber a few weeks ago, and a sign of somewhat aggressive action. The Justice Department uh, won a second case against Google, declaring it a monopoly in two different ways just last month. So what I'm trying to say is, I think that there is a more robust anti-monopoly happening in a cross-partisan way. All right, and that is uh, confusing for a lot of people when you see at the inauguration, here are all these tech billionaires lined up with the president. Isn't he going to be best buds with them? Well, these are competing factions. Like Zuckerberg went to the White House multiple times to try to get Trump's FTC to drop this case. They didn't. Who knows? Maybe they'll settle next week. I have little faith in this administration broadly. But there is antitrust now. Let's put it this way: on the right is very different than it was in the Bush years, and certainly on the left, it's really changed as well. So on the big on big tech in some ways is the tip of the spear. But I don't think it's just about big tech. I mean, it looks like the Justice
Yeah.
Department is investigating United Healthcare and some
Yes.
other big companies as well. So we will see. It's only been a few months. I don't want to get too far out and say there's this new consensus on antitrust, but there are, at the very least, there are real competing strands in the Republican Party, some of whom are interested in more. They're
Right.
interested in competitive markets. They're interested in capitalism working and believe that antitrust is a way to do that.
And, sort of one of I don't know if you've seen the film. Have you seen Can't Look Away, the documentary? No. Well, I guess my question to you is, when you think back all those years ago to when you started Facebook and Can't Look Away, it's I've written about it here. Josh Hawley is very much in it, actually, but so are Sheldon Whitehouse. I mean, bipartisan efforts. It's to do with obviously the content that is on all the social media companies and the algorithms that then lure particularly teenagers in and can cause great harm. And the idea that obviously when Facebook Meta was founded, it wasn't it the purpose of it, right, was nothing to do with this. Were you thinking about how to hook a 16-year-old so that they would come back for more and more and more?
No, 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 no.
No.
I mean, so So I was at Facebook from 2004 until 2007, and my tenure was, I mean, it makes it all look quaint or cute or something. I mean, we had profiles, and you would surf from profile to profile, and only, a year and a half, maybe 2 years in, did we create the feed product, the just, what we all now know is the algorithmically determined surfacing of content, which was controversial from the very first day when it was rolled out. And then we opened up Facebook to non-college students about 6 months before I left to go work on the Obama campaign. So my my several years at the beginning, it was a different company. Now that said, it was clear that you wanted eyeballs and you wanted attention, you wanted clicks, because that meant you were like providing a product that people wanted. And at the time, I guess I would say that I didn't see anything. It felt like, well, why wouldn't you want to give people what they want? And then I think over the past 20 years, we've realized, well, a lot of the time that's a great idea. Sometimes, particularly with kids or even teenagers, um, they might not be ready yet. So
Mm.
there's this movement, Australia, even in New York State. We don't have to go halfway around the world. If you're a minor now, New York just passed a law that you can't be served algorithmic content unless your parents approve. So you can still see what people are posting, but it's not going to be boosted because it's controversial or lascivious or whatever it is. Um, and there are some people who push just for, age bans. You can't be on social media if you're under 16 until the brain further develops. And I have two kids of my own. They're 7 and 5, and my son David asked me over the weekend when he was going to get a phone, and I made a bad joke. I said 18. And
Exactly.
because and he didn't realize, obviously it's not going to be 18, but I was like, I want it to be as late as possible. And he didn't realize that. And so then he was like quite sad. And I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't, it's not
Yeah.
actually 18. But he's like, well, when is it? And I'm like, you're 7. It's going to be a long time. And I'm really, and the reason what I explained to him is our attention is extremely valuable. And as an adult, I'm 41. It is so hard for me to put my phone down, to put it aside, to know when to put it in do not disturb, when to even turn it off. That's the thing. That's a muscle you got to really build. And so we're going to have to work on that together. And I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I don't think the onus should always be on parents to figure this out. There are ways. I mean,
No,
why can't we just
no,
buy an
it's not.
iPhone from the Apple Store that is set up so that it comes programmed with settings that are for folks who are under 18, and then you have to have an adult to make all these other things possible. And of course, if some parents want to do that, they can. But like, why isn't that basic option available? Well, we all know because that's going to make a lot of people less money.
Well, and I think the other issue, right, is it Section 230 that you started a digital, yeah, social network, but it has become a media
Yeah.
company, but it isn't regulated as one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for people who don't know, Section 230 is a law that gives blanket immunity to social media platforms so that they are not liable for what they boost. And it
Yes,
is nothing like that exists in any other industry. If a mall is responsible if you slip on the floor,
exactly.
whereas Facebook, if, they're quite dark. There are a lot of things that happen that are very dark on social media, which it's not responsible for. So if TikTok, elevates a video about teen suicide,
Yeah,
it will gain more eyeballs. And there's a case in the courts, which is why I'm bringing up this particular example of a young girl who did kill herself after watching it. And TikTok is able to elevate all kinds of very dangerous content in order to attract more eyeballs, attract more attention, and make more money. And because of this liability shield, they're not responsible for it. They can't be held liable, even though they are making, some human programs the algorithm to make that decision. And so I think that should be repealed. The one other thing I'll say on this is, the AI bots are not social media, because what they produce is considered original content. They are not immune from prosecution. And what you see is that it's actually very hard to trick an AI bot into saying something nasty, or like, giving it a photo of a young person and saying, "Oh, simulate taking off all of their clothes," or this. Like, if it were to do that, that company would actually be liable for it. And so I think you're seeing a different and safer story in those, with those
Interesting.
companies emerge. And so we're seeing this real time experiment where the trash bin of social media endures, and then, there are other ways.
Wow. Well, if you don't have time, you're doing on a book tour. But when you do, I recommend watching this documentary. I've written about it on my Substack. Can't Look Away, because it's pretty upsetting, but compelling, and I think important
Yeah,
viewing.
yeah,
So, Chris, I want to thank you for taking the time, and I want to tell everyone to please read your book, because what I haven't said yet, but will say now, is that it's you write in a very compelling way, and I really feel like you get to know each of these 12 characters. I will tell you that actually the guy I didn't know very much about, but sort of came away impressed by, was Simon Bill,
yeah. Bill Simon. Yeah,
who was a libertarian,
yeah.
right?
Oh my
But who
God,
kind
he
of
was the
but who
hardest character to write about, because he was just a real asshole. He was just a real
but
onion.
he but
You go through his papers and his writings. He just didn't care about people. He'd made a lot of money. He was just, I don't know. He was not my. I didn't enjoy doing that. And he was a really effective market crafter. He stabilized energy markets in the first half of the 1970s in the Nixon administration, much more successfully than the folks in the Carter administration at the end of the decade did. And so, even if we don't like people, I think we need to learn from
I
them,
thought it was really, I
when they're
thought that was
successful.
very interesting.
So,
Yeah, the oil crisis. I thought
yeah.
was, I mean, and that, yeah, I thought was very interesting. I learned a great deal, and I could talk to you for hours about the woman, Catherine Ellington,
Alex.
and Alex, because when you explained to me in the chapter about her, the tragedy of the American healthcare
Yeah.
system. I mean, and there was a moment in time I felt where just a moment where there was the possibility of socialized healthcare in this country. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if you put it like that, but it felt like
Yeah.
that, and it was just, and it was over. Anyway, so everyone, please read this excellent.
I know it
Um,
exists. I'll show you. I'm going to show you my
oh yeah, tell me
my
the
stack of them. Is this
yeah
kosher? I don't know. On the Substack Live, we have all the.
yeah
Here's the actual book. It's Market Crafters: The Hundred
yeah.
Year Struggle to Shape the American Economy. There it
Awesome, awesome.
is.
Chris, thank you so much. It's really good to catch up with you.
Thank you. Good to chat.
Take
See you
care.
later. Bye bye.
Bye.